Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen, can hear me correctly, and can see our other presenter and co-host. So welcome back to our webinar number 6 on barrel maturation today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Aude Watrelot. You will have a short introduction of myself by Drew in about 40 minutes, maybe. So I'm organizing and co-hosting this webinar with Drew Horton, who is a research specialist of phenology at the University of Minnesota. Yep, just on the term, like the good topic. And so today we will discuss about barrel maturation. So just before we start, I just want to make sure you all know about the instructions, so what to do. So the webinar is being recorded. If you want to have access to the recording, you can. Drew, can you mute yourself? Oh, I mute you. So you just need to send me an email and I will provide you access to this folder that we contain the recording as a previewer. Also, remember that you can type any of your questions during the presentation or at the end, either using the Q&A box or the chat box that you may see on your screen. If you don't, just click on the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen and you should have access of either the Q&A or the chat box. And so all the questions will be answered at the end of this webinar because we have 30 minutes. And also at the end, you will receive an email with a link for a survey. So please take a little bit of time just to complete this survey because we are always looking for feedback. On that, so just a little bit of organization of this webinar. So we are glad to have Joe Lutomske from Enotools, who will present the practical aspect of barrel maintenance and the use of barrels for wine maturation. And then after his presentation, I will present a little bit of research data on barrel maturation. And then we will finish by the question and answers. So now I will just leave Drew to introduce Joe.
All right. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Joe Lutomske. I've known Joe and his wife, Nikki, and 2 daughters for about 10 years now. Joe is a friend, a colleague, and he's one heck of a mechanic. I could tell you the story of the time Joe drove 10 hours nonstop overnight from Springfield, Missouri to Kasota, Minnesota to repair a broken compressor on my wine press right in the middle of harvest in 2012. But that's a story for some other time. Joe Lutomske is Enotools.com. He's a native of Watkin Glen, New York, in the heart of the Finger Lakes wine region. Joe is the Midwest representative and technician for Carlson & Associates Winery Equipment. Joe and Enotools.com also represent Amarim, a top-level cork and closure company, LaFour winemaking products. And he also reps a few lines of various bits of cellar equipment, specialists who provide pressure washers, barrel washers, on-demand water heaters. Most importantly for today, Joe represents Barrel Associates International, one of the truly top producers and distributors of French, Hungarian, and American oak barrels. Joe and Enotools.com have been in business for close to 20 years, and I can assure you his reputation has been time-tested and approved by hundreds, if not thousands, of loyal and repeat customers throughout the East and Midwest. So without any further ado, Joe, let's hear from you.
Wow. Thank you, Drew.
And you can share your screen whenever you want.
All right. Well,
you should be able to.
So that sounds like I have some big shoes to fill on this presentation. I'm going to give it a whack. All right. So first time sharing a screen in my life. Here it comes. Let's see. How did we do? All right.
Yep.
Looks good.
It works.
Looks good.
Okay. So don't let the title distract you. There's a lot of about 16 years of combined knowledge of a couple of different Coopers and a few friends in the industry. I had help from my very impressive phone a friend list on this. So we will get started. So again, as Mr. Horton said, I am Joe, the founder of Enotools, and this is about barrels. So first, a brief history. Imagine toting something like that to a friend's house for a party full of wine. Back in the day, so to speak, and this goes well before BC was a thing. Wine lived in containers like this, which would be problematic to transport. At least one winery in Sonoma County that I know of has a few of these on display. Theirs are about 5 feet tall, and they had that pointy bottom and were designed to toss overboard so that they would stick in the sand when the ships pulled into port, in order to retrieve the wine after transport. And then wine storage, it became a little more popular to use palm wood in a long, skinny design like this, which, from what I understand, is heavy and not convenient, and probably, by just taking a wild guess here, because of the density of the wood, it must have been hard to keep it from leaking as well. And then there was a discovery of wine living in oak barrels, which is the way we know barrels today. And there are several types of oak out there, which I'll get into. If you've ever done any woodworking, you can understand that dealing with oak would be a pleasure after dealing with something harder and denser like palm wood or a ceramic container. Some of the highlights, looking at this slide now for this presentation, I see that I put down a couple of points that might seem kind of obvious, but it's important to keep in mind that being watertight is an important factor for storing liquid, of course, but wine actually has a different viscosity. So you have to hand it to oak, or having the ability to contain something which is more likely to infiltrate a crack or a flaw than water itself. Here's a map. This is where you start to figure out very quickly why I've never been on the History Channel. This is a part of the world that we know as France now, but back when, right about where Burgundy is, was a part of the world called Gaul, was right around the time that having wine in oak was discovered. And the Romans, of course, got around quite a bit in those days, and they were great at borrowing really good ideas. So if they saw something that worked in architecture, art, whatever it might be, I think they had a reputation for glomming onto those things. So if you're making wine or just starting out with the idea of possibly, having a winery, and you have some questions about whether or not you should get into barrels. I mean, you hear all kinds of things about barrels. You hear about nightmares of transport or microbial issues. And there was one gentleman who I've been talking to on and off here lately, who acquired a winery full of barrels, and in the process he inherited a gigantic microbial issue, which had to do with roughly 100% of the inventory he acquired. So a barrel can create some complexity that maybe something made out of stainless steel or another material might not. But in general, pros and cons of using barrels. It's going down the pros. It's a tradition going back to, roughly 350 BC. And there's a reason for it. There's a transaction that takes place between the wine and the barrel. It's a symbiotic relationship where one preserves the other and vice versa, not without additional care. Certainly, wines aged in barrels have a certain complexity, more stable color, or maybe even a prevention of loss of color during aging. The influence of oak on wine is such that it can change the finish and the structure for the better, add certain nuances and flavors that maybe would definitely not be there if it were in stainless. It can add aromas of oak and other things relevant to that family of scents, and you can amplify the aromas which are naturally in the wine, and reduction of tartness and addition of perceived sweetness, and the marketing appeal, being able to talk about your barrels in the tasting room. When you know, imagine yourself being the one doing the tasting. You're standing behind the tasting room counter with a bottle in your hand, telling the story of the wine all the time, knowing that when people come to a winery, they purchase the experience. The wine should be good, it's implied. And if you run into, you know, someone from that 3% of the population who gets really, really excited about wine and its legitimacy and its value, you know, they love nothing more than to hear about exactly the type of barrels you're using and what percentage of those are new. I mean, I've heard a bunch of questions like that in my moonlighting times in tasting rooms. The cons, the bad things you might hear about barrels: upfront cost, no doubt about it. Sanitation concerns, absolutely. It's just about impossible to sanitize a piece of wood. You can keep it clean. You can control the population of things which might pose a threat to the wine. You can take preventative measures so that it never happens, because it's not bulletproof. There is the topic of loss or evaporation. I like to think of that as concentration of all the good stuff in the wine. And then there's the concept that round storage vessels are not space efficient. They can be with the proper racking system. You need to know a couple of tricks. Every winemaker in their survival kit needs to have one or two things around to take care of a small leak in a barrel. You know, warranty issues are another discussion. You know, if it just plain doesn't hold liquid, you know, upon arrival, that's bad. But, you know, if you have some small inconsequential leak here or there, or maybe a cosmetic issue, it's good to lose your fear of rolling up your sleeves and be prepared to tackle that. There is extra effort involved with having a building full of barrels full of wine versus a bunch of tanks. Barrels do eventually need to be replaced at some point. And this, I don't want this to come across as a total distraction, but on that last item on the cons list there, it does take time for wine to mature in a barrel, but think about the alternative. You know, keeping wine in a tank for 18 months isn't going to pay off nearly as much as, you know, an extended aging period in the right barrel. So the concept of carrying inventory, well, you know, if you're good at spinning things for marketing, you can certainly use that to your favor. So here's one point that's super important when it comes to barrels. Keep reminding yourself about this when you're writing a check for them. The perception of quality is there. I mean, it's something that it does definitely bears weight in the marketplace. People love to see barrels when they tour the winery, and you can't help but love them. I mean, especially when you know what goes into building a barrel, the smell of a brand new barrel when you take it off the pallet. It's a pretty exciting experience. And then, of course, as you walk down the path with the wine, you know, you check it out at the 1 month mark and do another tasting, you know, basically as often as you like. But right around 3 months in the barrel, you start to get an idea what that barrel's personality is like. So why not just use alternatives? This is a slippery slope because I'm the inside guy. You know, I've made wine, but I can't use a capital W in front of the word winemaker anywhere near my name. I've spent a lot of time knocking around people's cellars all over the U.S., a few places in France and Australia, and was invited one year to judge in a competition. And every now and then I have a good day where my nose is spot on or my palate is paying attention. And I can give you some decent feedback, and I know the sneaky cheats for using sticks instead of barrels. So I can argue either side of this. But here's something I didn't anticipate. This slide is from Lefort, the company. It's about a 150-year-old company based in France. They're the manufacturer who supply our enological additives. So this slide was borrowed from Lefort, and they were showing here what their aim was with this slide was showing how good their oak tannin additives are compared to a barrel. And I'm not picking on these products; they have their place in the market, and there's certainly never a reason to not consider using them in your process. Oak tannin can do things for wine like preserve the potential for aromatics later on, et cetera, et cetera. It can help structure and all those things that barrels can do. But please pay attention specifically to number 10. That was the wine in a first fill barrel, and look how that scored. Wines 7 through 10 were from first fill barrels. Their average score might be lower than the average score of the wines which just had the oak powder used in them at some point, or excuse me, powdered tannin. But the point is that the top scoring wine on the list was one from a new barrel. Carrying on that same thought, same source of this research. This is also a Lefort slide. Looking at the top 5 scoring, the ones most preferred by the panel they used. You can actually use an older barrel and add oak alternative to it and achieve pretty much the same result as a barrel, but it won't be the same as that barrel when it was new. The reason is, you're putting a different piece of oak in there. The critical part of the process is the integration. Extraction is only part of the discussion. But you see, again, look how well number 10 did. It scored pretty well in, the enhancement of the fruit that was already in the wine. Good aromas, good structure, flavor complexity, like you anticipate that a barrel would do. Added complexity, added structure, and length to the finish. I don't think anyone likes a wine that's a lot like a door slamming at the end of the first taste. You want something that lingers, like a glider landing, or like a tablecloth sliding off a table. So, types of barrels. If you're a newbie, if you're just getting into this, you might hear about Hungarian barrels, and it's kind of fascinating because they're effectively a lower priced alternative to French. And then there are those people who love American barrels and are willing to fight about it. It was funny, a few years ago, those quote unquote Robert Parker wines were in vogue, the 98 scoring wines, which were typically bombastic, high bricks, high alcohol, sledgehammer of oak sort of wines. That some of them, it got to the point where it was basically like a truckload of jam and alcohol with a pile of oak timber on top. To my palate, I guess I have a wimpy palate because some of those wines were just getting to be too much. So there's been a little bit of a gravitation towards a more austere version of that formula in the last few years, which is nice. Not to say there's anything wrong with anybody's specific style. Personally, I can appreciate a big butter bomb Chardonnay as much as an all stainless non-ML, cold weather version of a Chardonnay. So I can appreciate any wine, but the point is that American oak has that reputation for being a little more boisterous than French oak, and Hungarian is somewhere in between. So these days, everybody wants to talk about sustainability, recyclability, upcyclability, carbon footprint, all that good stuff. Not only do we owe so much of our wine traditions here in the U.S. and our love for it to our European roots, but specifically to the French. Were it not for his venomous hatred of the British, the finance minister for Louis XIV would not have had this idea to institute a practice of preservation and expansion of the French oak forests that we now derive all of our fantastic French barrels from. The entire industry, the wine industry in the U.S., should just always keep that in the back of your mind, that the sustainability idea is not new. So the picture here for dramatic effect reminded me, excuse me, if you have children, reminded me of the story of the Lorax, the one lone tree left standing. In my imagination, I could picture the French going out of their way to build the biggest and baddest wooden ship navy. And I'm just glad somebody was there, to preserve the forest. And I'm glad that that conflict went by the wayside as well. So here's a comparison. Here's what France used to look like on the left. And here's what France looks like on the right to a guy like me. Person who sells barrels thinks about France in terms of the forests and the growing regions. This is a very broad sweeping generalized map. It doesn't drill down to the specifics of, example, where the Transe forest is, or which the Transe region within the Allier forest, to be more specific. And as a backdrop in that photo, what you see are barrel staves, which have been rotated during aging. And I think these might be headed towards being headboards. This is a picture I took in Burgundy at a cooperage with a handful of sample staves. And one of the employees at the cooperage was nice enough to mark out the growth rings for us for this photo. What you see here, I mean, everybody has looked at wood grain at some point before. You can't help but notice. So to break this down, what this means to a winemaker, the dark part of each one of those visible growth rings as marked is actually the part where the tannin that we love the most lives in the stave. So the next time you're in a barrel room, go ahead and stand there for a good long time and look at a barrel at eye level and compare stave to stave. And, just do a visual survey. Look at an American barrel next to a French barrel, or look at a Hungarian next to an American, or whichever, and pay attention to if the barrel is American, is it Missouri, Minnesota, or Appalachian? Something more specific like Pennsylvania, for example. You will see a difference in how far apart these rings are, how wide the dark parts are of the growth rings, and you'll be able to get a look at how tight the grain actually looks in the stave, which gives you an idea of how long it would take to extract the flavors available to any given fill in that barrel, and should also lean you towards knowing just about how long that wine would have to stay in that barrel for it to integrate. The T is Transe, the V is Vosges. Looking at the two of those, it's pretty obvious that the Transe wood has the tightest grain, and Transe again is within Allier, and Allier is the middle one there. So this T would be a sharp contrast to a piece of wood from Minnesota, for example. Now here's something that's interesting, and I wanted to include, I'm not going to beat this to death, but I just wanted you guys to know, the last Louis XIV / Colbert tree was cut down in 2005, 300 years later. And some cooperage in France, to remain nameless for the moment anyway, paid 38,000 euro for that tree. So I can't imagine what it must be like to have the budget to buy a barrel from that tree. So you might be leaning towards, okay, sure, what the heck, we'll pick up some barrels. I'm very interested in putting wine in barrel, or maybe you already do. How do you go about choosing them? Well, it's pretty important. The part of barrel selection is only about 45% of the importance of the concept, though. It's all about follow through. No matter what you pick, you need to keep meticulous notes on what happened. So you need to know what wine is in which barrel, what year every barrel is, and then of course you should have copious notes as well on what the fruit was like, which yeast you used, etc. So knowing,
Joe, this is a courtesy announcement. You're about halfway through your time. Just want you to be aware.
All right, thank you. So keeping good notes on what you do with the barrel after it shows up is a great idea. Sizes of barrels, again, choosing barrels, you can choose by tradition, or you can choose by your end game, knowing exactly how many gallons you'd like to have in barrel. And you can go anywhere from 15 gallons up to, whatever size you want. I mean, everything's available. Traditionally, the shapes that we see most commonly are Burgundy and Bordeaux. The Burgundy barrel is traditionally around 93 centimeters long and a little bit fatter than the Bordeaux. The Bordeaux on the right are usually around 95 centimeters long, a little bit skinnier. Bordeaux's hold 228 liter, or sorry, Bordeaux on the right holds 225 liters. Burgundy on the left is 228. A good way to remember this for the bottles or the barrels is there is some similarity. The Bordeaux bottle and the Bordeaux barrel are both taller and skinnier. This is just for perspective. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around what a 300 liter looks like. So most American wineries we walk into have either Burgundy or Bordeaux barrels, but there is an American shape. Thanks to Gallo. Gallo spec'd out a barrel of Burgundy diameter and Bordeaux length. So it's kind of a tradition that Americans lean towards a 265 liter, which also decreases your oak to wine ratio a little bit. Probably, on a dollar per gallon basis, may even be a little bit better deal. 300 liters have gotten very, very popular in the eastern half of the US in the last couple of years. The reasoning for that could be that the marketplace is leaning towards a little bit less oak influence on the wine. So barrel toasting is not barrel burning. There's really a lot that goes into this, and most cooperages, most salespeople who sell barrels will talk your ear off about their toasting method because everyone wants to be different. The end game is the same. As I wrote here, the quality of the raw materials, the culling process, and the wood aging regimen can decide the need for toasting. That's a really kind and politically correct way of saying that if you're over toasting your barrel, you're probably cutting some corners on your wood. Great wood, the right kind of oak that can pass the most stringent standards can go with a very low level of toast and get the job done. But oak that's not aged as long as it should have been, or maybe has some other shortcomings as far as origin or something like that, should be toasted a little bit more to take away some of the greenness. Toast and toasting levels. The lingo in the industry is typically light, medium, or heavy. Medium plus is a term we use a lot. Most common with French barrels are untoasted heads. American barrels a lot of times have toasted heads. Generally speaking, if you picture super heavy toast and then picture a marshmallow that you've toasted on a stick over a fire, if you just lightly burn the outside of the marshmallow, you get a hint, you get a little whisper of what an extra heavy toast will taste like. Things that would normally be like vanilla would turn into, a creme brulee or something like that. I don't want to go too deeply into that because, the nuances of what fruit can do and what oak can do. But in general, the lighter the toast, the more fruit there is in the nose. The heavier the toast, the more oak there is in the nose. These are pictures taken inside a cooperage in California. This just happens to be Barrel Associates Fresno facility where they build their American and Hungarian barrels. What you see here is just the toasting process, and there are nuances to this. This is just one way to do it, with the barrel flat on the floor and nothing covering it, and that is a fire of oak scraps. So potentially this heat and the smoke are from the same material the barrel's made of. The bending process, this is something else that's exciting about barrels. You could potentially wash away harsh parts of the flavor of the barrel by using hot water. So if you get brand new barrels sometimes and they smell a little sharp, one old technique is to give them a good, healthy, long rinse with hot water on purpose to take a little bit of the edge off that first fill. Some people think of that as diminishing the value of the barrel because you're taking some of what you paid for, which is oak impression, out of the barrel. So There are effectively only three ways to bend the barrels. You can either do it by water bending, which is effectively like pressure cooking the wood on its way to being bent into that barrel shape, or you use fire to get it nice and hot so it'll bend, or you use both. When you're buying barrels, you can buy new, you can buy used. If you are buying used barrels, buyer beware. You've got to be careful that you're not bringing home a truckload of stinky wood. And you can do a lot of research on this online and read just about anything you can find about on forums or what have you about used oak. Wine Country Classified is a good place to look for, second fill barrels or third use barrels or whatever, with some kind of an assurance that they're good and usable when they arrive. So back to this previous slide. French barrels, when new, can be anywhere from $900 to $1,500. Part of that expense, of course, is getting them across the Atlantic. But also, the French so tightly manage their process that it's important to keep in mind that, the guy who's out there in those forests, cutting down those very specific trees which were designated for harvest that year, he might be the grandson of the guy who used to do it before him. They have this amazing long-term view of their sustainability there, and they know what trees will be cut down 5 years from now. So I'm sure all of that management, adds to the overall cost of acquiring the wood and then coopering the wood after aging. American barrels, you can find them a lot cheaper, like $450. Closer to the 600 mark is where you get good quality American barrels, which are, in some cases, a combination of Minnesota and Missouri wood. And, you can get some very, very nice barrels for that price point, around 600. And Hungarians are in the middle. Barrel cost over time. It's hard to picture spending $1,000 on a barrel. It just, it's painful. It hurts. But the way to break it down is like this. A lot of those barrels will have some oak impression left in them until their fifth fill, if properly cared for and intelligently cleaned and maintained. And so 300 bottles over 5 years, 1,500 bottles at the end of the fifth year total. So 80 cents a bottle. I'm telling you right here now, if you can't get $1 more a bottle for your wine using barrels, you're doing it wrong. You should be able to charge $5 more a bottle if you're using oak effectively. Barrel selection, you can analyze this to death. And whichever person you end up interfacing with to purchase barrels potentially is a good person to bounce these things off of. And also, talk to your consultants, talk to your academics, and see where a good starting point is for your barrel program based on your varietals, where your grapes are grown, how long you intend to age for, and what your most recent vintage was like. But remember this, always, one great barrel is a lot better than having 5 mediocre ones in your cellar. I realize the solution for pollution is dilution, but if you don't have, a barn full of one kind of wine, it's going to be really hard to hide those 5 nasty barrels that you save money on. It's better to use old neutral barrels with $20 worth of sticks in them and one great brand new barrel than to use 5 mediocre new barrels.
Joe, you've got 5 minutes left, Joe.
All right, I'll see if I can wrap this up that quick. Ready? Aging time. Okay, so in the barrel, 2 things happen: extraction and integration. That's as short and sweet as we can do it. Preparing barrels. Always be sure to give your barrels a good soak before you fill them with wine. Give them an honest chance to swell up. And I can share this presentation with anyone who wants to send me an email afterwards, or just whichever page you're interested in, whichever. But I have some good notes here on a procedure for introducing a barrel to your cellar. Topping and just generally checking out the barrels every 4 weeks is best. I know winemakers who check even more often their sulfur levels. One guy comes to mind in Virginia. Every week he's checking his SO2 in his barrels. Here's another slide that I'll be willing to share with you to save time, rack and return. And after emptying, how to maintain barrels. Here are the most common things that we discuss. Something has to be clean before it can be sanitary. Ozone is a sanitizer, not a cleaner. Barrel cleaner, like right here in the top left of the 4 window pane there, that is a pressure washer driven barrel washing head that will remove tartrates and whatever other waste might be in there. On the bottom, you have the ozone machine with a low pressure, high flow spray ball, which is good for rinsing a barrel. So if you're using chemical treatment instead, that's a good tool to have as well. Common chemicals I've seen people using on barrels: caustic soda, proxyclean, or sulfur citric. These are good rinses for after the barrel has been emptied and rinsed out. This is another slide I can share with you, or I can talk to you on the phone at length about what to use to get barrels clean and then sanitary. You hear people talking about sulfur wicks and sulfur discs before storage. This is what that stuff looks like. And if you want to be extra safe, SO2 gas in a clean and sanitized barrel for storage is a good idea. But a barrel's best friend is being full of clean wine. And that is it. I came in under the deadline, under 5 minutes. So there's my contact info. You might want to write that email down, joe@enotools.com, or just remember that website. The phone number's there.
Thank you, Joe. I'm sure we have a lot of questions regarding the maintenance and what the people are supposed to do with the barrels, but that will be for the question and answer session.
Okay.
Drew, do you want to introduce myself? Or?
I will. And I was just going to follow up what Aude said. And Joe, I'm sorry to rush you along, but we do have a schedule, and people are making time out of their days for it. So I try to keep on that schedule. But what Joe said is true. If any of you participating, watching, you can call Joe. You can email Joe. He can send you a copy of his presentation. Or if you can't get a hold of Joe, you can call me or email me, and I can help you with similar information. All right. So thank you, Joe. Now it is my honor and pleasure to produce Dr. Aude Watrelot. Dr. Watrelot graduated with a master's degree in biology and health from the University of Nantes in Brittany, France. Following this, she pursued her PhD studies at the French National Institute for Agricultural Research, INRA, and the University of Avignon, obtaining her PhD in food science. The focus of her PhD research was on the interaction mechanisms of polyphenols and pectins in a model system, the apple. Following graduation, Dr. Watrelot decided to continue conducting her research into polyphenol macromolecular interactions, but with a model change. And that's why she moved to California and conducted research on red wine chemistry with a specific focus on the mechanisms of astringency at Cal State University, Fresno, and also at UC Davis, both in the Kennedy and Waterhouse laboratories. After 4 years in California and prior to her work at Iowa State University, she returned to France to conduct research on the chemistry of enological tannins, again at INRA, Supergro in Montpellier, in the Chenier laboratory. Off you go, Aude.
Thank you very much, Drew. I know that was difficult to pronounce all the cities in France, but thank you. So today I'm going to talk about some research data that I gathered regarding the maturation of wine in barrels. So before we start, I just want to mention that maturation and aging are two different things, like two different events. And I'm sure during all my presentation, I will always use the term aged wines, but that's not exactly correct because maturation and aging are involving a lot of different reactions. that should lead to an improvement of the wine quality when it's conducted correctly, but they are quite separated reaction or events. The maturation event is everything that happens during the bulk storage, meaning before bottling, compared to aging, which is after bottling. So yeah, most of the time everyone mentioned aged wine, but that's not exactly correct. Anyway, there are many factors that may impact the wine quality during maturation and aging. That includes the time of maturation or aging. That also include the temperature and the relative humidity of the storage condition, like your storage room. Also, the type of container enclosure may have an effect on the wine quality. And depending on your choice as a winemaker of the container and the maturation and aging time, that will bring different wine quality parameters. So now, what are wooden barrels? So Joe mentioned a lot about what are wooden barrels and a little bit of history. So historically, the barrels were made from wood that were near the area where the people were making wine. And so it was, and it's still used, different species of trees to make barrels in the cooperage. And so the chestnut, acacia, cherry, ash, and obviously oak can be found to make barrels. So the most common white oak is used to make barrels because it has a really good characteristic. That's one of the strongest hardwoods. That's also a very good container for liquid tight. That's a liquid tight container. It's made from staves. So the staves, as Joe mentioned, that's the long pieces of wood, of oak wood that are fitted tightly together with the metal hoops, as you can see here. And so those staves from white oak are resilient, bendable, and durable. And also, one other characteristic of the white oak is that the minimum shrinkage going from wet to dry. So after making the barrels or preparing the barrels, then you will have some different toasting levels that can be from light to heavy, heavy plus. And depending on the type of toasting, you will have different characteristics from the wood that will go into the wine. So for example, the new barrels with a light toast will tend to give some vanilla and caramel notes to the wine compared to a heavy toast that will provide more the smoke, like smoky, toasted, roasted flavors, almonds. So the flavors that you will have into the wine are coming from the wood, and that's because the wood is composed of different things. So you will have the non-volatile compounds and the volatile compounds. And also you may have some compounds that are extractable, meaning they can be extracted from the wood to the wine because the wine is a hydroalcoholic solution. So with this system, this medium, all this system can extract compounds from the wood. On the other side, you will also have some compounds that cannot be extracted from the wood. That is some polysaccharides and polymers, including the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. All the three polymers are responsible for the rigidity of the wood, but they are not extractable. However, when you apply a toasting, or when you toast your barrels, those polymers will be affected. They will be affected by the toasting process, and the degradation of those polymers will lead to some volatile compounds. And so that's the degradation products that you will obtain into the final wine. That would include some furanic aldehydes, like I would say furfural, that's related to the almond aroma you can find into the wine. That's due to the degradation of the cellulose and hemicellulose. Also, you may have some phenols and aldehydes related more to the smoke, clove aroma and some vanilla aroma coming from the degradation of lignin. But if you don't apply a hard toasting under hard toasting condition, you won't have a lot of those compounds released. On the other side, so for the extractable compounds, you may have already some volatile compounds that will be extracted from the wood that include the whiskey lactones responsible for the coconut flavors that you may have in your wine. And also other phenols would be extracted that are related to the clove aroma. And another type of molecule would be extracted from the wood are elagitanan. And so those elagitanan are a type of polyphenols responsible for the mouthfeel of the wine, And so depending on the toasting parameters that will be applied to the wood, to the barrels, you will have a lower concentration of those compounds. So anyway, that was just to provide you some overview of all the compounds you can have into the wood and that will have an effect on the wine quality. Because what happens to a wine when you put your wine into a barrel and you mature your wine? So the first thing is the wood will absorb some of the wine that would be into it, especially for the new barrels, because it has a specific porosity of the wood. Also, due to this porosity of the wood, you will have some evaporation of the water and the ethanol from the wine. So you will lose a little bit of wine. That's called the ullage. So you will lose some of your wine, but that's depending on the environmental condition. So depending on your storage condition in terms of temperature and relative humidity, you may have more or less evaporation of wine. Also, when you have your wine into the barrel, you will have some extraction of compounds, as I explained before. You will have some phenolic compounds extracted from the wood. So the elagitanan would be extracted from the wood into the wine. Also, you will have other volatile compounds extractable from the wood that you will find into the wine. Also, because the barrel is made of staves that are tightly tied together, you still have some, not hole, but you have some area where, like between the staves, so the stave joint and at the bung hole, you will have some area where you may have some oxygen diffusing or coming from outside into the wine. So you will have a diffusion of the oxygen through the wood, and this oxygen will come into contact with the phenolic compounds of the wine, and that will have an impact on the total wine quality. That will have an impact on the color, on the mouthfeel, the perception of the wine, also on colloids that you may have some sedimentation during maturation. So as I mentioned briefly, the role of barrel maturation. So why would you why would you buy a barrel to mature your wine? These are a lot of different beneficial aspects. So the first one would be if you want to have a wine with a stabilized color, you may use a barrel, because in red wine, for example, there are a specific type of polyphenols, the anthocyanin, that are the red pigments found into the red grapes and therefore into the red wine. Those anthocyanins are free initially at the beginning of fermentation, but then with some compounds extracted from the wood into the barrel, that will be able to form some complexes, and those complexes lead to a stable color. So that's why it's helpful to color stabilize the red wine, as you can see on this picture. So in young red wine, that's more pinkish color compared to a mature wine, red wine, where it's more like red, deep red color. Same thing or similar thing will happen for a white wine. So you may have a change of the white color or yellow color in white wine when you mature into barrels. That's because you may have a little bit of oxidation of some polyphenols from the wine, white wine. And so the color will move from a pale yellow to a deep straw color. So that's a good way to color stabilize. Also, why using barrel to mature? That's to enhance the aroma and the flavors into the wine. So as I mentioned before, you will have some extraction of volatile and non-volatile compounds. But then by the toasting temperature, toasting time, you may have some degradation of polysaccharides or polymers from the wood that will release some volatile compounds. And so that's another way to, another benefit to use the barrel, that's to provide some aroma and flavors to the wine. Also, as I mentioned, you will have some extraction of elagitanan. They are hydrolysable tannin from wood. And those elagitanan have different potential, so they can be protective against oxidation. So they will be able to react with the oxygen that diffuse through the wood, and then they will avoid having more oxidation on the polyphenols from the wine. Also, those elagitanan, they are tannin, and the meaning of a tannin, that's the reaction between tannin and proteins, tend to lead to the formation of complexes that then precipitate. And this mechanism of interaction and precipitation of complexes is one of the mechanisms of the astringency perception. So the astringency perception, that's really like the drying sensation you have when you drink a red wine. So elagitanan, or the use of barrel, can also be beneficial if you want to improve a little bit the structure of your wine, the mouthfeel of your wine. However, if you use a brand new barrel and you're just extracting a lot of elagitanan, if you have too much elagitanan, you may have a negative sensory effect, meaning that you may have a little bit or too much wood sensation. When you will taste your wine, you may have too much. So I call it wood taste, but it's not a taste. That's more like a mix between the flavor and the perception. So as Joe mentioned, to make the decision of what type of barrel you should use, what type of wood you should use, you should know first that it's highly variable. So there is a large variability of barrels, or I would say of staves, for the production of barrels between the botanical origin, the geographical origin, even through the same species of oak, you will have a large variability. So the raw material is really important for the variability. The processing that is applied to the wood is leading to some variability. Also, the barrel capacity is leading to some variability in terms of extraction. The number of times the barrel has been used and the purpose. So those points, bullet points, are all the things you should remember when you want to make the decision of buying a barrel and maturing your wine into the barrel. So regarding the botanical origin, I'm just showing you here one figure coming from an article of in 2014. So they just look at the sensory profile, the general sensory profile of a Syrah wine that was, so they called it aged, but that was matured for 1 year into barrels from different species. So they look at the effect of the oak, chestnut, acacia, cherry, and ash. And so you can see that the oak was always higher in terms of the vanilla and the toasty and almond caramel characteristic, the flavors, compared to, let's say, the acacia, seemed to be slightly like more spicy. The wine was more spicy than by using another type of wood. Also, so the use, I think that's ash would lead to balsamic. I'm not sure what they mean by balsamic, but it leads to a different profile. So depending on what you want to do or what type of quality you're looking for when you plan to mature your wine into a barrel, you should remember that depending on the wood species you will use, or the barrel you will use from a specific wood species will lead you to specific sensory profile. And so just to mention, that's on a Syrah wines, so that's on Vitis vinifera wine. We don't know about the cold hardy grapes or cold hardy wines. So also another source of variability is the geographical origin of oak. So as it was mentioned, we have oak in a lot of different places, mostly in North America and in Europe. So in North America, there is a predominant oak, which is the Quercus alba. This Quercus alba is rich in aroma such as the coconut, so the whiskey lactones. As you can see on this graph, I tried to make this graph, sorry, just to show you the difference between a European oak and a North American oak in terms of aroma compounds and elagitanin. And so you can see that the North American oak is providing a little bit more coconut aroma, but not very much of elagitanin. So it's leading to a poor contribution to the wine structure if you use a North American barrels. And then if you want to apply a European barrels into your wine for maturation, you may have a high impact on the wine mouthfeel because that will extract a lot of elagitanin from the wood. Also, that will lead to more almond or roasted almond characteristic because that would be coming from the degradation of the cellulose, like polysaccharides you may have, depending on the type of toasting you apply. But just so you know, there are different characteristics depending on where they are coming from. And so, as Joe mentioned, so here I have a more detailed map of France, and the Tronchet forest is here in Allier region. So another source of variability, as I mentioned, is the raw material. So even if you're looking at the same forest and the same species, so let's say you're going into the Tronchet forest, between the trees, you won't have the same characteristic of wood because that's highly variable between all the trees. Also, between like the position of the wood into a tree, that will lead to a large variation as well, because that's different if you're looking at the heart of the wood or if you're looking more around. And also the type of grain. So the type of grain, wood grain, is the distance, if we can say like that, between one ring of 1 year and the next, and the ring of the next year. And so depending on the distance between those two rings, that's providing the information about the grain. And the grain is really important. So it goes from superfine to coarse grain, so less than 1.5 to more than 3 millimeters. Sorry, that's in millimeters. I don't know in inches, but I give you this calculation. And so depending on the type of grain you will have into the wood, you will have more or less release of important compounds. So for example, the elagitanan will be highly released when it's a coarse grain. So when the rings are highly, like with a high distance between the rings, compared to the superfine grain, where you will have less release, a low release of elagitanan. And also regarding some aroma compounds, you will have more clove release when you have a tight or a fine grain rather than a coarse grain. And you may have a little bit more whiskey lactones, like the coconut aroma, for the coarse grain. So anyway, that's just something you should keep in mind. And as Joe mentioned, try to take a look at the staves that you will have. If you go in the cooperage, just try to see what type of staves you will have, what type of grain you will have, because that will provide you an information of the expected aroma you may extract. So another important thing is the processing of the wood, because the wood would be processed, meaning you will have a seasoning. So depending on the time and the temperature of the seasoning, you may have different characteristic into those wood parameters. And the toasting is also important. So the time, the temperature, and the humidity is important. And so I just wanted to show you some results that I've got from some of the work I was doing with Vicar Group, which is a French cooperage that I did. So when I was at Fresno in California, at Fresno and then at UC Davis. So we look at the effect of two different initial toasting temperature and 3 different levels of elagitanan into the wood, because they have a specific process where they can look at the elagitanan content into each staves. So in one stave, they can have high elagitanan content. In the other stave, they can have low elagitanan content. And they did prepare some barrels with high elagitanan content for all of the staves, low elagitanan content for all of the staves. So we were really looking at the tannin potential. That's what we called that was related to the elagitanan concentration into the wood. So we compare those 3 levels of elagitanan content and those 2 temperatures. The study has been done on Cabernet Sauvignon, matured for 12 months with those parameters. So low TA, 5 grams per liter, high alcohol, 15%, and a pH of 3.7. So here is just to show you the concentration of elagitanan we've got into the red wine for each individual condition. And so you can see on this graph that at the end of 12 months of maturation, we had the highest extraction of elagitanan. So we had a high concentration of elagitanan into the wine. It was always increasing, and at some point it would just reach a plateau, and that will just be the final concentration of elagitanan into the wine. Also, we did compare between the different conditions. And so LTP, that's the low elagitanan content into the wood. So you can see that even after a year of maturation, we had a much lower concentration of elagitanan into the wine compared to a high tannin potential, which is a high tannin concentration, elagitanan concentration into the wood. So the extraction was just leading to more elagitanan when it was from high elagitanan into the wood. And then the effect of toasting temperature. So we use 160 degrees Celsius as the initial temperature and 180 degrees Celsius as the initial temperature. And you can see that comparing, so I'm always looking at after 1 year, we had after toasting at a higher temperature, we had lower elagitanan into the wine. That's because it was after degradation due to the toasting. So also we looked at the anthocyanin, so the loss of anthocyanin during maturation, and we compare those two initial temperature and the 3 L-arginine content into the wood, and we observe that the low toasting temperature was leading to a lower loss of anthocyanin, so probably a lower loss of color compared to when we look at also the effect of the L-arginine content into the wood. We observe that the high L-arginine content into the wood was leading to a lower loss of anthocyanin. So that just meaning that the L-arginine from the wood were protective against the anthocyanin, or protective against probably oxidation, probably other reaction happening on the anthocyanin. On the other side, we look at the different sensory or aroma compounds. And so the high L-arginine content into the wood was leading to a lower, so if you compare LTP and HTP, that was leading to a lower whiskey lactones, so lower coconut aroma, compared to the furanic aldehydes related more to the almonds, roasted almonds, that was higher for the high L-arginine content into the wood, higher vanillin as well, and as I mentioned previously, higher L-arginine. Regarding the effect of toasting temperature, that was so high toasting temperature were leading to higher coconut aroma, higher almond aroma, higher vanillin, and lower L-arginine. So that's just to provide you also some information about the effect of toasting, and maybe that will be helpful for you to know how to decide what level of toasting you're looking for. So as Joe mentioned briefly, the barrel capacity is different and have a different effect on the wine quality. So it goes from, so the Bordeaux barrels are 225 liters. I think it's not on the picture, but it's between those two. And then that can go up to 650 liters, up to 1,000 liters. Anyway, the larger the barrels will be, the lower the surface to volume ratio will be, and therefore you will lower the extraction of the compounds, because you need to have a large surface to volume ratio to be able to extract correctly, I would say, the compound that you want. So why not using wooden tanks? You can, but because they are larger than barrels, you won't extract as much as just from a Bordeaux barrel. Also, an important thing to know, and I think most of you are just wondering, should I buy a new barrel or should I buy a used barrel? So the number of times the barrel has been used is really important, because that won't give you the same the same compounds, that won't provide you the same extraction rate of those compounds from the wood to the wine. And here, maybe that's too small, sorry for that. That's a study that has been done in 2006 on the effect of new barrel versus the once used barrels on the aromatic compounds, and also I think the L-arginine. And so they observed that the once used barrel was providing less aromatic compound, or most of the time that was providing less aromatic compound, so a lower amount of vanillin, lower amount of eugenol, glycol, methyl glycol. However, if you look at the time of maturation, the difference between the new and the once used barrel, sometimes that's coming to the same. meaning that when you will have to select between the new versus the used barrel, you would have to remember, or you will have to know how long you're planning to mature your wine. Because if you're planning to mature your wine for more than 12 months, maybe you can use a once used barrel, because that will lead you to the same thing, the same potential characteristic as a new barrel. Also, you may have, when you use a once used barrel, you may have more ethyl phenol compounds, but those compounds are coming mostly from the microorganism. So I don't think that's something you really want to have. So make sure that you know exactly the risk you can have when you use once used barrel or multiple times used barrels. Also, used barrels can lead the new barrel can lead to some sensory characteristic really strong that will just mask the sensory characteristic of the wine. So make sure you know exactly what you expect to have. So should I use the wooden barrels? So that would depend on the type of wine and style that you want to do. For the fresh and fruity aromatic whites, and also for some light rosé and young wines, sometimes the oak maturing is seldom needed for that. Then, oops, Drew, okay, I saw your text or your message. I'm almost done. For the red, if you have a high tannin red wine, you can think about maturing your wine into an oak barrel. Then the oak economy related to all the wood barrels are something you will have to think about, because that's a lot of money, that's a lot of work, a lot of maintenance, and some risk. Then, so if you don't want to use some barrels, that's fine. You can decide to work on oak wood product alternatives. So that's a good way to obtain the oak-derived flavors. You can do either that alone, or you can do a micro-oxygenation, which is a good way to mimic the oxygen diffusion through the wood that occurs in wine oak barrel maturation. You can do the combination of those two, so using alternatives and micro-ox. Make sure when you apply the micro-oxygenation, you know exactly what to do, just because that can be quickly a macro-oxygenation. And when your wine is oxidized, that's too late. So just the take-home message. So prior to use the barrels, think about all the different points I showed you and Joe mentioned. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of background about the wine quality from cold hardy grapes and those wine maturation in barrels yet. So if you're interested in doing a research study, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have any question, feel free to send me an email or use the Q&A box and the chat box to type your question now. And I think we have time. Yeah, we only have 15 minutes now. Sorry for the delay.
And 15 minutes for follow-up questions is fine.
Yeah.
Great presentation, Aude.
Thank you.
So far, I only see one question, and I'm trying to pull it up here.
I saw one in the
there
chat
it is.
box.
I have it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is from an excellent Minnesota winemaker, Russ Funk, Carlos Creek. He says, some of my wines seem to fall apart around 15 to 24 months in barrel. I have a feeling I'm either introducing too much oxygen through racking and topping or not enough. Can you address oxygen use and or susceptibility of oxidation during aging. And I answered him by asking if these were cold climate grapes, and he just see real quick, he says, no, these were vinifera.
So I would say, what does he mean when he said it's falling apart? Is it browning? Is it like, does he know the color? Does it affect just like the sensory perception, like the flavors or the mouthfeel? What does he mean?
I agree. And I keep seeing an answer pop up, but then it doesn't stay. Keep trying, Russ. Yeah, it would be good to know what he means by falling apart, whether it's the flavor and aroma, or is the color, is it starting to brown, or is the color starting to fade? Those are good questions.
So that can be oxidation.
I'm going to offer one personal note from my winemaking. I don't think more than about 1% of the wines made on the planet deserve to be in oak longer than 12 months. The vast majority of the red wines I've made have been anywhere from 4 to 9 months in barrel. I'm a winemaker that likes to keep my wines fresh. And I also, the wines are in demand, so you need to make them and put them in bottle and sell them. Imagine if you're keeping a barrel of wine for 2 years in your cellar. You're carrying that inventory for 24 months. You're taking up that space for 24 months. So purely as a bottom line business or practical reason, I'm not fond of keeping wines or any wine I've ever made in barrel in 2 years. Certainly, some of the very, very top flight vinifera wines in France or in Italy or Spain can easily spend 2 or 3 years in barrel. But those are vinifera wines with lots of tannin and perhaps a lower pH and a higher acidity. Maybe they can take that long time in barrel. Anyway, you were going to say,
Yeah, and I agree with you. I would say that if your wine doesn't contain a lot of tannin originally, there is no way you can mature for more than 12 months, but then your wine won't be very good. Like the quality would be, you will have probably more risk for oxidation, because if you are really low in tannin, that won't last. I think that's what I mentioned when I was saying we don't have a lot of background about cold hardy grapes. That's because I think some winemakers just want to use barrels for the cold hardy varieties for the red wines, but we don't know what it's providing. Is it good? Is it bad? We don't know. Especially like for the color stabilization, the anthocyanin responsible for the red color are different than Vitis vinifera. So we don't know how the barrel maturation will have an effect on the color stabilization of cold hardy wines. Also for the tannin, as you mentioned and I mentioned, it's pretty low in tannin, so I'm not sure that will last for a few months or a few years in barrels.
I was unable to get Russ's answers on screen, but Russ has my telephone, so he's just texted me. He says what he means is they tend to lose flavor intensity and structure. And he says, just as I was speaking, his router dumped, and so he missed what I said. I'll repeat myself quickly. Russ, I'm not a winemaker that believes that any wine, whether it's Marquette or Mourvedre, whether it's a hybrid or whether it's vinifera, needs to spend 15 to 24 months in barrel. You're taking a big chance keeping a wine in barrel that long. Yes, they can get too much oxygen. the majority of the red wines I've made in my career, whether they were vinifera or hybrid wines, cold climate wines, I've kept them in barrel as little as 4 months, somewhere between 4 and 9 months, and I get enough of the style of wine I'm trying to produce. I also mentioned that just in terms of business and practicality, if you're keeping your wines in barrel for 24 months, you're carrying that inventory for 2 years. You're occupying those barrels for 2 years. You're building up a huge inventory. I think there's this, and I don't want to say myth or legend, and I'm not impugning that you're not an experienced winemaker, but I've heard this many times, where newer winemakers or winemakers who sort of didn't come up through the ranks in California, there's this sort of feeling that aging, or maturation, I should say, is always good, and that more maturation is always more good. And to me, that's a myth, and I'd like to debunk that right now. I like wines that are fruit forward, that are fresh, that are vibrant. And so I would never keep a wine in barrel for 2 years, both for that reason and for carrying the inventory and taking up all that space for that time. But yes, I think you may be running into oxidation problems. Are you topping your barrels every 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks? Are you checking your free sulfur every 4 weeks? Are you checking your pH? You can undergo pH issues if you're having any spoilage issues. If your wine is slowly producing acetic acid, you may see the pH dropping. So there's a lot of considerations. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, and I agree with you. So I just find one question, Joe, that would be more for you. Joe mentioned that an advantage of oak barrels is a reduction in tartness. How does this occur? Is there a reduction in TA? Thanks.
All right, so I've been thinking about that. I sent a preliminary response through typing, but I wasn't sure what the settings were and whatever else. Not being a chemist by nature and feeling way outclassed on that topic by the other two on the panel, it's with great trepidation that I speculate for my response that it's not so much about chemically altering acidity in the wine with its time in barrel. I think that it's more or less about sublimating it or amplifying the things that we look to the barrel to do, therefore reducing the perception of tartness. In other words, where the barrel's job is to build a frame around the picture, which is the wine. And when you're thinking about a wine being balanced, I ask technical questions every time I sample a wine when I'm visiting a cellar. If I try a specific wine, I'm going to turn and look at the winemaker and say, what was the pH and TA and Brix on this fruit when it came in? Just for a pin on the map. And so I think that I'm relatively sensitive to pH. I'm fairly good at sampling a wine and telling a winemaker what the pH is within 1/10 of a point just from tasting. So to me, I think it's more or less about bringing the balance of the wine, the other features of the wine into perspective compared to TA. So if you're building a frame around the fruit, you want the fruit to be amplified. You want the structure of the fruit, the finish to all be comparable, basically. So if TA is the overbearing feature of the wine, then certainly you could enhance it by adding tannin, and maybe that tannin comes from a bag and maybe it comes from a barrel.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would say you're not changing the TA just because, so in the study I have been doing on the Cabernet Sauvignon, the TA was exactly the same before barreling and after barreling, or after maturation, I should say. So the TA is not changing. The pH is not really changing. And I think that's more a balance, as Joe said, between the polyphenols, so the tannin, mouthfeel, that will balance with the acidity and probably the tartness. Yep. I don't see any question. Do you see anything?
I see one more question. I see two more questions.
Oh.
One is a quick question from Dennis Dorakers. I think he's in Holland or somewhere in Europe.
In the Netherlands.
Oh, the Netherlands. Okay, the Pays-Bas, the Low Countries. What do you think? What do you think of the new mixed barrel trend? I myself love it. I buy barrels. When I was a commercial winemaker, I was buying barrels that were French staves with Minnesota oak heads, or Minnesota staves with French oak heads. We call them hybrid barrels, but I've had very good luck with them here in the Midwest. If a barrel is part American and part French oak, hopefully you're getting the best or something from both worlds. Certainly, if you're only making small batches of wine where you only have 2 or 3 or 4 barrels, a hybrid barrel is a good option to build complexity. So I like the mixed barrels myself, to answer that. Another question from Eric Higi. Eric says, I'm working with a lot of cold hardy varieties like Marquette and Petite Pearl. He says, I know not all the varieties are the same in the Midwest, but most are pretty light in tannin and body. Would I suggest a lighter toast to just not get in the way of the complexity? I think you're confusing a few terms here. If you wanted complexity, you would use barrels of different toast levels and barrels of different origins, I would think. I might use a lighter toast to not get in the way of the more delicate nature of a wine like Marquette. I would use lighter or medium toast with Marquette. Petite Pearl has more body, more vibrance. I wouldn't be afraid to use medium or medium plus toasted barrels with Petite Pearl. Keep in mind, I have noticed over 10 years that Marquette extracts new oak very, very quickly. In my world, too quickly. So after my first vintage here in Minnesota, I no longer used new oak barrels in my Marquette. I would use 1-year-old or 2-year-old, once filled or twice filled barrels on my Marquettes, and I found that the flavor profile was much more moderate, but I still having good color and good body and good complexity and good texture. So I tend not to use new oak barrels with Marquette. And that's the rest of the questions, and we're at 4:28.
I have one more question. Joe mentioned that 1 grade barrel beats 5 average one. Besides cost, how can we tell a grade barrel versus an average barrel? Cooper reputation, distributor reputation.
May I? Well, where do we start? So a few years back, I'm told, I haven't validated this, so I'm going to preface this with a trigger alert. I am told that a few years back, some of the cooperages, specifically in France, had to go through an audit to verify the origin of their staves, because there was so much folklore out there in the American wine industry about the origin of the staves. And as Dr. Watrelot alluded to in her discussion, you can get 4 forests out of 1 tree, is the way I've heard it put before. So the romantic in me wants to say, okay, so here's a good stave from this great forest, and that forest has terroir, like your grapevines do. Everything that Mother Nature produces is an expression of the place where it grew. So we're gonna bank on the fact that these forests are great and they're legendary for a reason, and they're good sources of wood. On the other hand, after this migration away from forest designations, some cooperages out there with questionable motives, let's say, dropped like a rock their forest designations on their wood, and they just started using more benign and generalized terms and concentrating on the grain, with the hope that they could hang their hat on the fact that the grain was more important than the forest. It is and it isn't. The difference is when you have a culling process which involves cooperage reaching a commitment to say, here's a barrel that we're going to say leans heavily on this forest, and here's what we consider the average stave based on the quality of the wood, consistency of the grain, and tightness of the grain from that forest that is simultaneously an expression of place and meets a certain set of expectations for grain classification. Then it's up to them to be honest about the wood that they need to keep and use. And then it's up to them to incur that extra cost of owning that inventory and sitting on that wood long enough to say, this is 24-month minimum aged wood. This is 36-month minimum aged wood. And those are important factors that I didn't really get the time to go into. I personally have experienced selling barrels from a cooperage that wasn't that great. When I first started Enotools in late 2003, 2004, I went into the business with the first cooperage I knew. And what I found was that we almost always had to over toast all of our barrels to hide the fact that the wood was sappy. It was underaged. It was subpar quality. And so the difference between a good cooperage and a bad one, here it is. Buy a barrel from a cooperage. If you like the salesperson, you like their website, whatever it is, you dig their wrap, you trust them. Buy one barrel from them, maybe two of the same barrel with different toast. Then the following year, do the same thing. Now go back and taste those two barrels. Are they anything like each other? Because if your cooperage can't successfully reproduce the result you got the first barrel you bought in year 2 or year 3, they're not a good cooperage. That means that everything they say about having strict controls in place and all their quality standards is just marketing. It all boils down to consistency, because barrels are a spice in your spice rack. They're a tool in your tool belt, and you need to know what to expect from this kind of barrel from that cooperage.
Yeah, in a nutshell, Kevin, I think, asked this question. Kevin, it does come down to a long-term quality, quality and consistency. I've spent years tasting wines from various wineries and all kinds of different barrels, and you develop favorites. You learn who's doing good work and who maybe not. I'm sure if you contacted myself or Joe one-on-one directly, we could go out on a limb and make some personal recommendations. But it does come down to reputation, consistency, and all those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if you see any other question, but we are like late, 3 minutes late.
All right. Well, I don't see any others.
Okay. So thank you very much, Joe, for your participation. And that was great. Thank you all for attending this new webinar. We will see you in 2 weeks, December 8th, and we will discuss about bottling and closure. That will be our last webinar of the year. Maybe next year we'll start again. We'll see. And so remember to take the survey that you will have by email. And so thank you very much. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yep.
Take care. Take care, Aude. Take care, Joe.
Bye. Take care, Joe.
Bisous.
Bye.
Bye-bye.